Section 39 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To find out more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rebecca Case. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 2, by Henry Gray. Muscles and Fascia of the Abdomen, Part 2. The cremaster is a thin muscular layer composed of a number of fasciculi which arise from the middle of the inguinal ligament, where its fibers are continuous with those of the obliquus internus, and also occasionally with the transversus. It passes along the lateral side of the spermatic cord, descends with it through the subcutaneous inguinal ring upon the front and sides of the cord, and forms a series of loops which differ in thickness and length in different subjects. At the upper part of the cord the loops are short, but they become in succession longer and longer, the longest reaching down as low as the testis, where a few are inserted into the tunica vaginalis. These loops are united together by areolar tissue and form a thin covering over the cord and testis, the cremasteric fascia. The fibers ascend along the medial side of the cord and are inserted by a small pointed tendon into the tubercle and crest of the pubis, and into the front of the sheath of the rectus abdominis. The transversus abdominis, transversalis muscle, so called from the direction of its fibers, is the most internal of the flat muscles of the abdomen, being placed immediately beneath the obliquus internus. It arises, by fleshy fibers, from the lateral third of the inguinal ligament, from the anterior 3/4 of the inner lip of the iliac crest, from the inner surfaces of the cartilages of the lower 6 ribs, interdigitating with the diaphragm, and from the lumbo-dorsal fascia. The muscle ends in front in a broad aponeurosis, the lower fibers of which curve downward and medialward, and are inserted, together with those of the obliquus internus, into the crest of the pubis and pectineal line, forming the inguinal aponeurotic falx. Throughout the rest of its extent, the aponeurosis passes horizontally to the middle line, as inserted into the linea alba. Its upper 3/4 lie behind the rectus and blend with the posterior lamina of the aponeurosis of the obliquus internus. Its lower 4th is in front of the rectus. Variations. It may be more or less fused with the obliquus internus or absent. The spermatic cord may pierce its lower border. Slender muscle slips from the iliopectineal line to transversalis fascia, the aponeurosis of the transversus abdominis, or the outer end of the linea semicircularis, and other slender slips are occasionally found. The inguinal aponeurotic falx, falx aponeurotica inguinalis, conjoined tendon of internal oblique and transversalis muscle, of the obliquus internus and transversus, is mainly formed by the lower part of the tendon of the transversus, and is inserted into the crest of the pubis and pectineal line immediately behind the subcutaneous inguinal ring, serving to protect what would otherwise be a weak point in the abdominal wall. Lateral to the falx is a ligamentous band connected with the lower margin of the transversus and extending down in front of the inferior epigastric artery to the superior ramus of the pubis. It is termed the interfoveolar ligament of Hasselbeck and sometimes contains a few muscular fibers. The rectus abdominis is a long, flat muscle which extends along the whole length of the front of the abdomen and is separated from its fellow on the opposite side by the linea alba. It is much broader, but thinner, above than below, and arises by 2 tendons. The lateral, or larger, is attached to the crest of the pubis, the medial interlaces with its fellow of the opposite side, and is connected with the ligaments covering the front of the symphysis pubis. The muscle is inserted by 3 portions of unequal size into the cartilages of the 5th, 6th, and 7th ribs. The upper portion, attached principally to the cartilage of the 5th rib, usually has some fibers of insertion into the anterior extremity of the rib itself. Some fibers are occasionally connected with the costoxiphoid ligaments and the side of the xiphoid process. The rectus is crossed by fibrous bands, 3 in number, which are named the tendinous inscriptions. One is usually situated opposite the umbilicus, one at the extremity of the xiphoid process, and the third about midway between the xiphoid process and the umbilicus. These inscriptions pass transversely or obliquely across the muscle in a zigzag course. They rarely extend completely through its substance and may pass only halfway across it. They are intimately adherent in front to the sheath of the muscle. Sometimes 1 or 2 additional inscriptions, generally incomplete, are present below the umbilicus. The rectus is enclosed in a sheath formed by the aponeurosis of the obliqui and transversus, which are arranged in the following manner. At the lateral margin of the rectus, the aponeurosis of the obliquus internus divides into 2 laminae, one of which passes in front of the rectus, blending with the aponeurosis of the obliquus externus, the other behind it, blending with the aponeurosis of the transversus, and these, joining again at the medial border of the rectus, are inserted into the linea alba. This arrangement of the aponeurosis exists from the costal margin to midway between the umbilicus and the symphysis pubis, where the posterior wall of the sheath ends in a thin curved margin, the linea semicircularis, the concavity of which is directed downward. Below this level the aponeurosis of all 3 muscles passes in front of the rectus. The rectus, in the situation where its sheath is deficient below, is separated from the peritoneum by the transversalis fascia. Since the tendons of the obliquus internus and transversus only reach as high as the costal margin, it follows that above this level the sheath of the rectus is deficient behind, the muscle resting directly on the cartilages of the ribs, and being covered merely by the tendon of the obliquus externus. The pyramidalis is a small triangular muscle placed at the lower part of the abdomen in front of the rectus and contained in the sheath of that muscle. It arises by tendinous fibers from the front of the pubis and the anterior pubic ligament. The fleshy portion of the muscle passes upward, diminishing in size as it ascends, and ends by a pointed extremity which is inserted into the linea alba, midway between the umbilicus and pubis. This muscle may be wanting on one or both sides. The lower end of the rectus then becomes proportionately increased in size. Occasionally it is double on one side, and the muscles of the 2 sides are sometimes of unequal size. It may extend higher than the level stated. Beside the rectus and pyramidalis, the sheath of the rectus contains the superior and inferior epigastric arteries and the lower intercostal nerves. Variations. The rectus may insert as high as the 4th or 3rd rib, or may fail to reach the 5th. Fibers may spring from the lower part of the linea alba. Nerves. The abdominal muscles are supplied by the lower intercostal nerves. The obliquus internus and transversus also receive filaments from the anterior branch of the iliohypogastric and sometimes from the ilioinguinal. The cremaster is supplied by the external spermatic branch of the genitofemoral and the pyramidalis usually by the 12th thoracic. The linea alba. The linea alba is a tendinous raphe in the middle line of the abdomen, stretching between the xiphoid process and the symphysis pubis. It is placed between the medial borders of the recti and is formed by the blending of the aponeurosis of the obliqui and transversi. It is narrow below, corresponding to the linear interval existing between the recti, but broader above, where these muscles diverge from one another. At its lower end the linea alba has a double attachment, its superficial fibers passing in front of the medial heads of the recti to the symphysis pubis, while its deeper fibers form a triangular lamina, attached behind the recti to the posterior lip of the crest of the pubis, and named the admeniculum lineae albae. It presents apertures for the passage of vessels and nerves. The umbilicus, which in the fetus exists as an aperture and transmits the umbilical vessels, is closed in the adult. The lineae semilunaris. The lineae seminularis are 2 curved tendinous lines placed one on either side of the linea alba. Each corresponds with the lateral